Greetings from McGowan 104 in Montreat, North Carolina. This is Benjamin Brandenburg. I'm happy to continue this course with you. I understand these are difficult and trying times for you, your family, and your friends. But digging into the way people lived in the past, the choices they faced, the choices they made, will hopefully give us clarity in our present moment. Our topic today and this week is the Great War from 100 years ago. I encourage you to watch this video with pen and paper on the side. Take notes on the key words as they may appear on the final exam. That said, let's jump right into it. So over the next 40, 50 minutes, I'll basically condense 3 lectures into one. We'll talk about the origins of the Great War, so a little bit of review of what we covered right before the break. We'll talk about life on the front, the way this was a global war. We'll look at some culture. We'll look at God in the Great War. We'll look at the way people dealt with so much death and suffering. We'll look at the ways people try to find a new world order, communism, American capitalism for the world. We'll look at the peace, and then we'll look at the pandemic of 1918, 100 years ago. So from a big perspective, this was a 4-year conflict from the 28th of July, 1914 to 11 November, 1918. The deaths were astounding. 10 million deaths, 20 million European continent. You have to remember that many of these heads of state are still monarchs. They're still kings. For example, here in this picture, this is a wedding picture from 1910. Most of these folks that go to war are first cousins. Right in the middle of there, you have King Edward the Seventh, along with on the top, King George the First and Kaiser Wilhelm II. People, they're cousins. They hang out camp together. So a lot of folks thought this was not really going to happen as tensions began to increase. But tensions do increase. And this imperial story starts in what is today Austria and Hungary. Now, this was and despite the branding of the military, as you can see in this image right here, all these different ethnicities serving together in one great Austro-Hungarian empire, the tensions were Serbia. The spark that creates this conflict happens on June 28th of 1914, when a young Serbian radical, a nationalist named Gavrilo Princip, assassinates the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, not to be confused with the really tremendous rock band of the mid-2000s. But in these images right here, we have the lovely Mr. and Mrs. Franz Ferdinand on a parade in Serbia. Right before this image was taken, or right after this image was taken, the 17-year-old Gavrilo Princip walks up, assassinates the Archduke, and tragically also his lovely wife, who's pregnant at the time. Now, they immediately capture this assassin and his co. And understandably, Austria is really quite upset about this. They ask neighboring Serbia, what's going on here? Why are these people assassinating our Archduke? Do you have any involvement here? They said, no, we're not doing anything. We're not involved. Here, take a look at our government. So Austria made 20 requests to neighboring Serbia about the assassination of their heir apparent. And Serbia said yes to every single one of them. So Austria declares war against Serbia. Serbia, a relatively small nation, asked for some help from their fellow Slavic language neighbors to the north, Russia. Austria gets scared. prospect of taking on Russia and their massive army and small little Serbia. So they asked for help from Germany, fellow language, and the Germans give them an infamous blank check. We will support you no matter what. So instead of being Austria versus Serbia, it's now Austria and Germany versus Serbia and Russia. As tensions mount, countries begin to mobilize. And mobilization is a very big thing because once you mobilize a huge army, it almost means you're going to war. The Russians, for example, mobilized a 5 million person army. So once you do this, it's really hard to step back. All right, so that's sort of the origins of this conflict. But why wider war? Why fighting in France that you may be familiar with? A lot of this has to do with rising Germany. Germany was a growing economic power, along with the United States, I should say, at the turn of the century. Their cities were booming, like Hamburg, Berlin, Munich, Leipzig. They had the leading universities in the entire world. In fact, they invented the university system. Eventually, even American colleges like Johns Hopkins University, Michigan, California system, even the Ivies adopt their university model. So they're very well trained, very educated workforce. There's an incredibly powerful military that had whipped up on the Austrians, the Danes, and the French in the previous 30 years in relatively small conflicts. So they feel confident. And they put a lot of emphasis on their race. There's also German nationalism. As we discussed previously in this course, nationalism is rising across Europe and the world in the 1900s. And in Germany, it's a very strong strain of this. They're not yet fascists, but they're beginning to have a distinct sense of who is German and who is not. So minorities like Russians, Slavs, and Jews in their community are being brushed to the side. Notions of superiority over the French and the British are very high. And you have this young monarch named Kaiser Wilhelm who really wants to prove himself, kind of like King Leopold II from a generation earlier. The big problem is going to be Russia. We've already beaten France earlier, way back in 1871, so they say we need to knock France out really quickly in the war. UK won't jump in, and then we'll turn our attention to the big problem, which they believed was Russia. So to do this, they have this plan where they'll attack France and go through neutral Belgium. So this is what happens in August of 1914. War is declared. Germany invades neutral Belgium, causing the British to jump into the war on the French side. And the plan almost works. They bulldoze their way through Belgium. It goes a little bit slower than they thought because the Belgians fought really hard. They used the trains. As you can see on this map, their armies make it almost all the way to Paris. But right before Paris, they're stopped. Bicycles. Well, maybe not all these guys. But the French had thrown all their troops that were in different parts of the taxis from Paris were bringing soldiers to the front. And right outside of Paris, the French and the British fight the Germans to a draw. And in an era where machine guns are present, people begin to protect themselves. So they dig trenches. And eventually these trenches are dug all the way to the Alps in the south, to the North Sea in the north, because people don't want to be flanked. So to sum up, the Austrian Archduke is killed in Sarajevo. Austria declares war on Serbia. Russia declares war on Austria. Germany declares war on Russia and France. Germany invades Belgium, then France. Britain comes into the war to help France. The First World War begins. But what was this war like? This world. This is a war filled with lots of death, lots of mud, lots of boredom. People were stuck everywhere. This image here shows the size of the rats. You can imagine what the rats are eating. They're absolutely humongous. It brought new phrases to life on the front, like going over the top, or words like shell shock, a version of PTSD 100 years ago. It introduced chemical warfare. So throughout the war, people are wearing their gas masks. Even the puppies are wearing the gas mask. This would be funny if it weren't so absurd. And later in the war, the British government wanted to do some positive propaganda, so they brought in an American painter named John Singer Sargent, who had spent a good bit of time at the Biltmore. In fact, if you tour the Biltmore estate when it's open again, you'll notice that the Vanderbilt family is painted by John Singer Sargent. But he went to the front in 1917, 1918. He was supposed to paint this heroic war image, and he painted a version of that was very different. Now, this image is absolutely humongous. It's in the Imperial War Museum in England. It's probably 10 meters wide. But here you have a whole bunch of British soldiers leading one another to safety. In the background, people are playing soccer. There's death and dying around them. You see airplanes above them. One soldier helping another soldier out. But this was a war that wasn't just fought on the Western Front. It was also very much halfway through the war in 1916, Britain introduced conscription in the face of incredibly high casualties. But most of the white dominions refused to enlist their men. Lots of Australians were of Irish ancestry, so they didn't care. The South African Boers were reluctant to fight for Britain. Riots in Quebec happened when the Canadian Parliament considered conscription, so it wasn't always easy to get to fight against the Ottomans in a desert campaign. The Middle East also featured what is today Turkey, just shy of what was called Constantinople or Istanbul. There's this region in Gallipoli where in England there was a young war planner named Winston Churchill. Remember him? He had this plan to save the British troops by sending Australians and New Zealanders up from Australia and New Zealand up to Egypt. From there, they would invade what Winston Churchill thought was the weak Ottoman Empire. They'd smash through them, and then they'd hit the Germans from the other side, helping the Russians out. This campaign, unfortunately for the British, was an utter disaster. The Turks fought brave. The Turks had machine guns. The Turks knew the British were coming. They were dug in on the high hills above Gallipoli, and it was just a bloodbath. In fact, Winston Churchill fell from power because of this and wouldn't really return until World War II. And this is important for Australians and New Zealanders because they still celebrate what's called Anzac Day, the Memorial Day for all those who lost their lives in World War I. And in the process, both Australia and New Zealand created their own distinct identity and put rules to further break away from the British Empire. So the modern states of Australia, what it means to be Australian or New Zealander, really is born in this World War I sacrifice. It's also global because it brought in the United States, who would emerge in the aftermath of this as the world's greatest superpower, at least on paper. But we'll get to them in a few minutes. I'm going to turn attention to culture in this. Here is an image from Britain. Fight the good fight, it says, with all thy might. Christ is thy strength, and Christ thy right. Lay hold on life, and it shall be thy joy and crown eternally. Right. Here's an image from Germany, where they write, denn dein ist das Reich und die Kraft und die Herrlichkeit in Ewigkeit. Right. There you can see Jesus blessing the troops with his prayers. The image that we saw repeated over and over again during this period was a crucifixion theme. Posters and cartoons depicted whole nations as victims of crucifixion. This was a very popular image in England, showing the Germans destroying a Belgian church. One of the war's most influential propaganda images concerned a Canadian soldier crucified by Germans in 1915. Now, this was long thought to be a silly myth. Tragically, the story turns out to be true. Here's a film showing an evil German, pressuring a French woman for information. There, you can see the cross behind them. The Germans persecuting the French. Commonly, this message was the same. If our enemies, whoever they are, claim to be Christian, why do they assume the role of Christ's persecutors and executioners? Does this not utterly undermine their Christian status? It should be said that some folks found God in the trenches. C.S. Lewis would reflect on this time, but also his colleague, his time serving, but also his colleague and his good friend J.R.R. Tolkien. He may have remembered from the films and, of course, the books. There were here a 1916 cartoon by Boardman Robinson called The Deserter showed a war-resisting Christ facing a military fighting squad. Another image asking for the apprehension of Jesus Christ, wanted for sedition, criminal anarchy, vagrancy, and conspiracy to overthrow the established government. Dressed poorly, it says. Like the Battle of the Somme, that was pure fiction. This was not actually images of the battle. This was a British film reel 10 miles outside of the battle zone, but it showed kind of war without blood. And this was seen by everyone in Britain. This was the most watched show in Britain's entire history. Like 85% of the population saw this film that summer. It was a war that brought up myths. In France, there's a region, a memorial called Tranche de Bayonets, the Trench of the Bayonets. On the right there, you can see these 4 bayonets sticking up from the ground in this photograph. The story was that the French were told not to retreat, and these men bravely held their spots as the mud was crumbling all around them in a landslide. They held the line, so to speak. Now, as it turns out, this is a myth. At this time, medics would actually use bayonets as a marker of where bodies lay underground, but you can see the resonance of this in this memorial on the left here. But I want to transition to talking about how this launched a search for a new world order. By 1917, and one option that arises is Soviet communism. So, for the Russians, the war went very, very poorly. The Germans had this whole big battle plan to attack the French to beat them first so that they could face the big problem, which was Russia. As it turns out, they got their planning wrong. Russia was relatively easy to defeat over and over again. German forces defeated the French in more freewheeling, non-trench warfare style battles. And the Russians, instead of surrendering against the Germans, eventually creating a situation where Tsar Nicholas II, there he is on the left with his lovely family, abdicates. And for a brief moment, Russia actually becomes a republic. They bring in a guy named Alexander Kerensky. He becomes a prime minister of Russia's provisional government in 1917. Ideas of Karl Marx are beginning to take a hold among the union workers in Moscow and in the vicinity. So the Germans hatch a plan to bring in an academic named Vladimir Lenin. You can see him on the left here. He's a student of Karl Marx. He's an ardent communist. He's living in exile in Switzerland. So the Germans send in some special agents. They give him 2 suitcases of cash. They put him on a top secret a top secret railway car to St. Petersburg. He heads to Moscow. He says he's going to launch a revolution. There's violence in the streets. The Republican government is overthrown. And now the communists are in charge. We'll talk about these folks in more detail later on the semester. But Lenin says some things that are, by and large, truthful. He says this war was a product of imperial rivalries. Can't really push back against that. He said the war signaled the end of capitalism. At the time, it seemed obvious. Global trade had come to a halt. He said the future lies in a global revolution carried out by the workers. Workers of the world unite. That part was perhaps a bit more dreamy. But he did sign a treaty called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918, which ended the war on the Eastern Front. While all this is happening, people in America are watching this war. They're not yet in the war. But the president of the United States, a gentleman named Woodrow Wilson, begins to hatch a vision for America in the world. In response to Soviet communism, he begins to think that it's up to the Americans to push another world order, which I'll technocratically call democratic capitalism. So what's the context here? Germany's not in the war when it starts, but in 1914, 1915, Germany gambles. They begin to use their new U-boats, and they begin to sink merchant ships that are supporting the British. This was a total war, you have to remember. On May 7th of 1915, one of these German U-boats sunk a cruise liner called the Lusitania. It sunk in 15 minutes with more than 1,000 souls on board. Now, we now know that that ship did have illegal arms shipments, one reason why it sunk and blew up so fast. But in the aftermath of this great tragedy, and of course this great evil, attacking civilians from a Christian perspective in warfare is, of course, always out of bounds. But these images of propaganda are really quite powerful. On the left, you can see one called Enlist, right? A young mother and a child sinking to the depths of the ocean, right? Many of the individuals on the Lusitania were Irish Americans who were heading to their homeland. So this sort of whipped Americans, this sort of changed America from being more isolationist to being more pro-war. So even though this happens, Woodrow Wilson runs on a platform saying he's going to keep America out of the war. But as soon as he's elected, he says what he actually believes. He wants to make the world safe for democracy. And he begins to urge America to join. They ramp up the propaganda. Right? Wake up, America. Right? Uncle Sam makes his entrance. I want you for the U.S. Army. And by 1917, 1918, Woodrow Wilson brings the United States into the war. The Germans, as you can see in this image, are viewed as the mad brutes, right? Raping the Belgian and French women. Now, the president has to have a plan for this. He calls this the 14 points. Let's take a look at that. The 14 points included reliance on open diplomacy, freedom of seas, free trade. Number 10, autonomy for the peoples of Austria-Hungary. So all those countries get to be their own little mini country. Number 12 is big. He asked for, quote, self-determination for the peoples of the Ottoman Empire. He's asking for a new Middle East. The 14th point called for the formation of a League of Nations to guarantee independence for all countries, large and small. We now know this as the United Nations. So this is sort of his plan. And he puts us forward to, and America enters the war. Now, when America enters the war in early 1918, the soldiers are called doughboys. They're not yet called during World War II. And these doughboys really turned the tide of the war. The fresh troops from America and the fact that the Western forces, Britain, France, and the United States, they decided to invest in really small tanks and they produced them on massive scales, while the Germans had these huge football-sized super tanks that were slow and lumbering. It's not a good idea. Tough break for the Germans. The Germans was the public that said eventually enough suffering, enough killing. They call for peace on November 11th, on the 11th hour, on the 11th day in 1918. An armistice is signed. The Kaiser resigns. A civilian government says we need peace. The next few images just show the joy you can see here in the United States of this announcement. Right. Here's an image from Philadelphia. And we should ask the question, why did they fight so long? So they meet in Paris. They meet in Versailles. And this image here, it's called the Hall of the Mirrors. This is actually the former home of Marie Antoinette and King Louis XVI. So Lenin and the Russians are not invited. People from all around the world come. But up in the air is what's going on in what's now called the Soviet Union. Right? Lenin has this vision for workers of the world uniting, overthrowing capitalism, overthrowing imperialism. It's not likely that his vision is going to take root here, but that's the context. Because of that, the Americans and Woodrow Wilson brought forward this vision of democracy and freedom and open trade, right? We might call this, and self-determination, we'll call this democratic capitalism, right? This is America's answer for the world. And then the powerful players, Britain and France, who lost a lot of lives in the war, they basically want to keep things as is. Let's keep reformed colonialism. We'll just do it better. We'll do imperialism with a kinder, softer face. Now, there's reason to believe that America's vision would win out. In France, Woodrow Wilson is greeted as a savior. Right here, we can see the sign "Vive la Wilson." The French Premier Clemenceau said this about Woodrow Wilson: he thinks he's Jesus Christ. Not a very kind thing to say about the President of the United States. Shows Wilson mania sweeping the globe. In China, people marched with slogans from his 14 points. The world must be made safe for democracy. You can see on this image here next to Chinese characters. People were enamored with Wilson. In this image, a very grainy one, you can see a young man from Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh was his name. Upper middle class from Vietnam. Barely makes it out to Paris. Says, hey, I represent the French delegation, the Vietnamese people in Vietnam. The French say, no, we actually run Vietnam. What are you talking about? He loves Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson is there speaking for self-determination. Of course, this is very ironic, given that the United States and this gentleman 50 years later would be involved in a brutal conflict. On the right, you can see an image from Indians talking about self-determination. I believe they would. Meanwhile, Japan gets part of China. And this League of Nations, on the bottom right in this slide, it's also founded with the hopes that there will be no more wars in the future, that this would indeed be the peace to the end of war. Now, in the short term, this was a failure in many ways. The last slide on this lecture deals with the 1918 pandemic called the Spanish flu. I invite you to watch the PBS YouTube video on this. You can see the link right there. It's also linked in the Open LMS site. After you view this lecture, I invite you to conclude the readings and then participate in the open forums. Just click the open forum, read the question, write a 200 to 250 word answer, basically a paragraph, by Wednesday at 11:59 p.m. And then return on Thursday and Friday and respond with a sentence or two to two other individuals who also commented on the question. Stay connected, folks. Talk to each other. Stay safe. Godspeed.